Well, welcome back to another episode of the Addy Hour. I'm honored today to be able to host a conversation about oxytocin and social behavior, community, and mental health. And in a lot of ways, these topics have come up in a lot of our conversations on this podcast already, but we really haven't been able to dig into the science of social behavior and community. So today I'm honored to be able to host two revered scientists, a revered scientist and philosopher, and luminaries in this area to really engage in this conversation. So the first guest I'd like to introduce is Dr. Larry Young. Larry is the director of the Center for Translational Social Neuroscience and the director of the Silvio O. Conti Center for Oxytocin and Social Cognition at Emory University in Atlanta. He's also the William P. Timmy Professor of Psychiatry at the Emory School of Medicine, and he leads the Center for Social Neural Networks at the University of Tsukuba in Japan. So quite a few different leadership roles. He's someone who's also been a recipient of numerous awards, including the Golden Brain Award, the Frank Beach Award, the ACMP Daniel H. Efron Award, and he's a fellow in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His research focuses on the neurobiological mechanisms underlying social relationships and how we can translate some of that into treatments for psychiatric illnesses with social deficits, such as autism. He's someone that I had the pleasure of interacting with over the years as a fellow neuroscientist. He's actually hosted me at his institution and served in some mentoring roles as well, which I'm really grateful for. So today I'm honored to be able to welcome him here to the Addy Hour podcast. Thanks for being here, Larry.
Thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful. Thank you.
The second guest, which I'd like to introduce, is Dr. Patricia Smith Churchland, who is a professor emerita of philosophy at the University of California, San Diego, and also an adjunct professor at the Salk Institute. She is someone who has been a pioneer in several different ways. Specifically, her work focuses on discoveries in neuroscience and how that impacts traditional philosophical ideas. She's the author of several books, one, the pioneering book, Neurophilosophy, but also the book, Computation, the Computational Brain, also Brain Trust, What Neuroscience Tells Us About Morality, Touching a Nerve, Conscience, The Origins of Moral Intuition. And she has been just a celebrated speaker over the years as well, having had listened to some of her recent and talks from a few years back. I've been really impressed with the way that she really has brought this neurophilosophy to the forefront. She's someone who's been the past president of the American Philosophical Association and the Society for Philosophy and Psychology. She won a MacArthur Prize in 1991, a Rossi Prize for Neuroscience in 2008, and a Prose Prize for Science for her book, Brain Trust. So someone, again, as I mentioned, who's very celebrated, was also a previous philosophy department chair at the University of California, San Diego. So I'm honored to be able to welcome Pat Churchland to the Addy Hour podcast as well. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really a great pleasure.
Well, I'm grateful to both of you for the work that you do. And again, this, I think, is a conversation that's been a long time coming on this podcast, as these topics and your names have actually come up on previous episodes. So full circle for us in a lot of ways. But as my listeners know, I often just like to start out and check in with how people are doing. Both of you, as we can hear from your CVs, have very active lives. And so I'm curious, how you're both doing in this moment, and also what occupies you in your time on a daily basis. So Pat, actually, if we could start with you, that'd be great.
Well, I'm doing very well, actually, but I'm retired, and so I can do what I want with my days, and I find that to be an absolutely amazing experience. So I do a lot of reading, of course, but I also walk the dog a lot, and I do about an hour of yoga every day, and meet up with my friends for drinks in the afternoon, and like that. I also watch some football.
Wow. So a full plate. I mean, that's encouraging to hear how active you are. You said you're retired, but you sound still very active in a lot of ways, which is excellent.
Lots of ways. Yeah. Well, at a certain point, of course, your body will tell you you're done. And it hasn't told me that yet. So I'm still, I'm still going.
Excellent. Larry, what about you?
Yeah, things are going real well with us here. We're able to, work in the lab and come to work every day and see people. There was a time when we didn't get to do that, and that really was strange, and I didn't like that very much. But so far we've been able to adjust pretty well. During the pandemic, I decided to really try to get healthy, and I started exercising. So now every day I sort of start my day off with an exercise routine and come into work and just try to, get as much social interaction as I can. One thing I do miss, though, is being able to travel as much as I used to be able to. Really meeting other scientists face to face. That's so important, and we've just been missing that for a long time now.
Yeah, I find that too. I mean, I find that Zoom works quite well when you're talking to people you already know. But if, like, I'm going to be giving a Zoom talk to folks in Saudi Arabia, and I would so much rather be there and then have a chance to interact with them and talk about the work and so forth. And so that is disappointing, but really in the long haul of life, it's not something I can complain about.
Right. But just that opportunity that we had before to, I mean, in a sense, experience the culture in a different way than you would.
Absolutely.
On the computer. Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. I know we're going to get to the social behavior piece eventually, but it's just, as I'm listening to both of you talk and thinking about your areas of research, and as you're sharing about the losses of having those connections, I think a lot of things are full circle in some ways. Although I will start with a question in a sense for both of you. Do you think, even as people who study social behavior, did it catch you off guard at all? How much we've missed those rhythms or how it's affected us? Or would you say that was completely expected?
I don't know. I think people do vary, both as a function of temperament and as a function of age and what kinds of routines and skills and so forth they have. In how much the isolation has affected them. It affects everybody to some degree, of course, but it's clear that some people are much more deeply bothered by it than others, and I'm not quite sure scientifically what that tells us.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there are some people who. They at first they feel they're thriving by being at home, and maybe they're introverted. They don't somehow social interactions are a little bit give them anxiety, and then I think that by completely avoiding those social interactions, but even when we have the opportunity now, I think that's really doing maybe some damage to their mental health. Especially if they continue to avoid the social interactions because they really are healthy.
Yeah.
Although it's funny, I was reflecting on all of this and thinking about, I grew up in this very remote area of British Columbia, and there were lots of people who would be off prospecting in the mountains for months and months on end.
Wow.
Maybe not even a dog. And then there were the fur trappers a little bit further north who would be out in the bush all winter trapping. And then they would come in the spring with their furs and they'd whoop it up a little bit and back they'd go. And I was, it made me wonder, is it perhaps the expectation of sociality and then not getting it that we find particularly painful? Because, these old prospectors and fur trappers, their social skills weren't terrific, as you may imagine. And of course, they certainly needed a bath. But on the other hand, they did not seem to have suffered mentally as a result of being on their own for so long. And it was just part of life then. Yeah. But now I look back on it and I think, how did those guys do that?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think certainly there's individual variation in how, how much we need social interactions. But I think for young people, it's especially important because they're still developing. Students and graduate students and people in the early phases of their career, I think the social interactions is so important for building the networks that help them succeed. Those trappers, maybe they were already fixed in their ways and all they needed to do was trap.
Probably were.
Yeah. So, but building that social skills because, things are going to change again in 2, 3, 4 years.
Oh, yeah.
And, our livelihood is going to, require social interactions and social skills.
Yeah.
And I'm just afraid that some people they're missing out on the normal development of those skills.
Yeah.
I think those are really important points. I'm intrigued about that. Not there's a clear answer, but the expectation component too. and how much that plays into it. So, I mean, you could just hear that in the public discourse and how much angst there seemed to be around the expectation to be together and the inability to be able to do that. To have to facilitate it through other means. And then Larry, to your point, I mean, all the developmental components, I mean, there's obviously an intersection there as well. I don't know if that's something that people will try and look at down the road. It's definitely an interesting question that will have long-term impacts. I mean, just developmentally thinking about how, I mean, even if we think about younger, kids, preschool and elementary school, what impacts this is going to have down the road for their social development.
Even those kids that go into school and they went for a couple of years not seeing the faces of other kids. The facial expression, we learn from those real social interactions.
Huge.
Rewiring that happens to help us learn, what other people are thinking, reading emotions, and they're missing that. And I think it's really kind of opened up a whole new field of study for the next decade or so. What has been the impact of this?
Right.
The other thing that's changing things so much is, with the COVID came this Zoom and the ability to interact so easily over Zoom. And, that's sort of really taking the place of a lot of regular social interactions. And, what are the consequences of that? And also dating. People have had a hard time dating, right? It's really, and now, so for a couple of years, people have had, have to date in a different way. And so that can have a long lasting impact as well,
Yeah. So much to process and think about. I definitely want to come back to that. But even as we've already touched on so many topics about development and the social interactions as well, I want to just take a step back and have you all actually take us through the science and philosophy of the social body and social relationships, because I know some in our audience are familiar with that. Some are vaguely familiar with it, have heard about oxytocin a little bit, or have heard about, the love hormone, as people sometimes make it out to be oversimplistic. Yes. But in a sense, just want to kind of start there and have you share what we know, both from your own research and your own thinking and from the field as well. So Larry, can you take us through a little bit of the biology of what we know at this point?
Yeah, well, let me first start, say something about oxytocin, since you mentioned that. And because this is a really important molecule for social interactions. And it was first discovered for its role in giving birth. It's the molecule that's released from the mother's brain when it's time to give birth, and it causes uterus contractions. And then after the baby is born, the baby begins to suckle, to nurse. Oxytocin is released to eject the milk so the baby can get the milk to thrive. But what we also know is that it's also acting in the brain to focus the attention of the mother to the baby and to bond with that baby and to feel a real sense of connection. And, that was some of the first knowledge that we knew about oxytocin and social behavior. And then in my work, we started working with these voles. These are little rodents. They look like hamsters. They're natural animals that live out in the Midwest United States. And there were two different kinds of voles. There was one called the prairie vole, which is they have a family life very similar to our own. The male and female come together, they mate. After mating, a transformation happens in the brain and they form a bond. And then they basically live in that partnership for the rest of their life. They raise their offspring together. Then the other species is a meadow vole. They're solitary. They're like those trappers. They prefer to be by themselves. And so we've been studying them to see, what is the chemistry of that bond in the prairie voles. And it turns out that oxytocin, the same molecule that's responsible for giving birth, is also helping to seal that bond between these prairie voles, that bond that lasts a lifetime. And oxytocin interacts with other molecules like dopamine, which is involved in reward and pleasure, and the opiate system. And what we've kind of learned is that, a pair bond, at least the strong romantic bond, is very much like an addiction to a partner. But now we know oxytocin is also really important for many other kinds of bonds, bonds between a dog and the owner. When your dog looks at you in the eyes, it causes you to release oxytocin and then want to nurture that dog. Also just, social touch, looking eye to eye contact causes oxytocin release. And it seems that what oxytocin is really doing is helping tune the brain into the social stimuli so that we pay attention to that and can navigate our social world in the appropriate way.
Excellent. Well, thanks for taking us through. I know a lot of people are going to be just enlightened with that information, and it's great to have that, that understanding again, because it's come up in so many different ways. And Pat, as someone who has, expertise both in neuroscience and in philosophy, or more appropriately in neurophilosophy, and who is also engaged in this, how has this information informed your work and your conversations with people around these aspects of bonding?
Well, it's huge, of course, because in one respect, it really constitutes the platform for what we call morality. But I want to step back and because the sort of bonding that we see in mammals and birds is really unique. And so you want to say, well, because many people have been very skeptical of the idea, Richard Dawkins actually is one, that there could be genuine altruism, that I could, as it were, sacrifice something of that I want for the good of another. And so the idea is that could never evolve, because if there were altruistic individuals, all the selfish guys would take advantage, and poof, that's that. So part of what really motivated me after I learned about the voles from Larry was, why would this happen? Why would there be this kind of evolution? And I think the story actually goes way, way back, about 200 million years, to the fact that warm-bloodedness appeared on the face of the planet. And the great thing about being warm-blooded is that you can forage at night. All those other guys have to wait for the sun to come up, but you can forage at night. But as with many sort of changes in evolution, there's a downside. And the downside is that gram for gram, a warm-blooded animal has to eat 10 times as much. Now, that's a huge evolutionary constraint. As you know, you can go off and leave your lizard alone for a week, and it doesn't, it's not going to be starving when you get back. It doesn't need to eat that much. And also, lizards and snakes don't take care of their young. They just have them and off they go. So what happens such that mothers, and in many cases fathers, especially in birds, do this amazing thing, which is make this enormous sacrifice for their offspring? And the answer is this, that to meet this ecological constraint of eating so much, getting so much energy, basically Mother Nature invented the cortex. And that's a way of letting the animals learn a huge amount about their environment, and hence, in a certain sense, makes them smart. Birds have cortex too. It doesn't look like it. It's just a little different from ours. So, okay, but if you're going to have cortex, then what? It better not be already fully developed. It better be so immature that the baby can learn from its environment. And that means the offspring are born very, very immature. So then Mother Nature has a problem. Well, if they're that immature, they're not like a turtle that can just come out of an egg and off they go. A baby mouse can't do anything. It's deaf and blind and hairless. And we're pretty bad too. So you have to have some sort of mechanism, and this is what obviously evolved in mammals and birds, some sort of mechanism whereby the thing that gives birth is also the thing that begins to take care of it. And oxytocin, although it was plentiful in the body all over the place for hundreds of millions of years, was put to a very new role. And that role had to do with bonding and feeling good when you were with the baby, feeling bad when the babies were gone, or if they were being predated and so forth. So that, I think, it puts morality into a completely different perspective from what most of the evolutionary biologists had thought for so long, namely that it has to be beaten into kids. No other animal has anything like it because it goes against evolution. And the answer is nuts. It is an evolutionary development. So there's more, of course, to the story, but I like the fact that something as indirect, shall we say, as being warm-blooded turns out to be the essential part of the causal story for the emergence of something like attachment and bonding, which is the essential platform for morality.
So much there, and so many things that we can pick apart too. And one thing I'd like to just follow up on, because we started to talk about this developmental piece a little bit already too. So what are the implications of that? Because you talked about the young not having that developed cortex yet and needing that bonding. So what are the implications of that bonding happening early on for life down the road? And for either of you who want to jump into that.
Well, I just held forth, so I'm going to let Larry start with that, but I'll talk about Alison Perkybile's work too.
Yeah, so we've done some interesting work in the voles that show that if the pups experience a little bit of neglect, so they don't get as much licking and grooming from their mother. That licking and grooming causes oxytocin release in the brain. And if for the first 2 weeks of life, they get less of that, then when they grow up, they actually have a difficulty forming relationships as adults. So, this work suggests that, as an infant, as the infant's brain is developing, the kind of nurturing that it gets from the parents, the eye-to-eye contact, the talking to each other, the touching, all of that stuff is causing a series of chemical events in the brain, such as the release of oxytocin, that's helped constructing the circuitry that determines how that individual is going to be able to relate to others later in life. And I think that that's a huge, it has some huge societal implications, because before, knowing this kind of research, people just think, well, the baby is born, they're going to develop however. But they really, their future child, your adult child really depends on how you nurture that child. It's really, really critical.
I think a part of the story that we haven't really touched on that's so important here is the other part of oxytocin, and that is the receptor on a neuron to which the oxytocin binds. Because what Larry and his cohort discovered was that it's the density of oxytocin receptors in very specific parts of the brain that determines whether or not you're going to be a long-term pair bonder or not. And similarly, we see that in some mammals, there aren't male-female bonds that are super strong, like in baboons. But what there are matrilines. The head lady and her daughters and her daughters and her daughters and so forth. And so we can see that just by, these subtle alterations of the pattern of where the oxytocin receptors are, you get changes. So to follow up on the developmental point that Larry was making, Alison Perkybile showed that when baby mice are taken from the mother and for even just a few hours a day, and they're not licked or groomed, but they're fed and kept warm, and then they're put back, what you see is a lowering of the density of receptors in the places where you would expect it. And like Larry's work with the voles, what she found was that when those animals then become mothers, they are, so to speak, bad mothers. They don't really care that much. They don't bond much to their babies. I mean, they don't have the mechanism. They don't have the receptors for the oxytocin to latch onto. And so I agree with Larry. I think this is just super, super important. I mean, we all knew that it wasn't very good to put those Romanian orphans in cribs and leave them there for years. But we understand in a very direct way now why it was so terrible.
Yeah, and that's so powerful. I mean, but what you both mentioned, just
powerful,
having that understanding of the brain mechanisms and how that impacts down the road. Go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, I was just saying, we did another study that's the first study that I mentioned was about, neglect, where the pups were like sort of left alone for 3 hours a day. Only 3 hours a day. That's not very much.
I know, it's amazing.
But we also did experiments where they were raised by only the mom or the mom and the dad. And so in the case with only the mom had to forage for food and left the pups alone in the nest for a certain amount of time. Or when they were both parents were there, they were always had a parent that was engaged with the pups. Even the pups that were raised only by the mother with just one parent, they had more difficulty forming relationships later in life. So it is not just, at the extremes. So I think the lesson from that is interesting. That it is the, sort of the total amount of nurturing that individuals get, that babies get, whether it comes from their grandmother, from their aunt, or from their father, or from the mother. It's, all of that sort of is a cumulative kind of thing. And so you can think of it, babies, this is a project that you're working on to try to build a healthy individual for the next generation,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. That is a beautiful experiment, actually. I didn't know about that. Yeah.
Definitely fascinating. And for those who are listening, who may be hearing a lot of the science for the first time too, I imagine that it's both fascinating and intimidating at the same time, because even as you're describing some of the experiments, that one perspective could be, well, if that's happened, does that mean that person is now, set to have disruptive relationships going forward? Or are there things that happen later on that can also still have effects on the brain when we talk about changes in the brain and plasticity? So how do those processes later on in life also intersect with some of these early differences that you talked about? Whether someone, if we think about humans, if people have had neglect in certain situations, is that something that, are they stuck in that category, or what happens down the road?
Yeah, no, I don't think that they're stuck in that category, but they have that trajectory. And if that trajectory isn't changed, that trajectory can change, as they reach adolescence or past adolescence, or even, as in adults. But it needs the attention to do that. Someone, either that individual or someone needs to say, okay, I need to engage in things that would put me in the right direction. And so it's just as long as we are aware. So even genes, we often hear genes predict behavior, but having a gene doesn't mean that you have to engage in that behavior that it predicts. It's just, these are all just vectors that sort of point people in certain directions. And if left alone, they will continue to go in that direction. But the knowledge that these are vectors that are pointing people in directions, and we know that that's not the right direction, we should think of ways to change the direction. Because it means, health and happiness all the way through life. We live way past our childhood. And we don't want to, if we had difficulty in childhood, we don't want to be stuck with the remnants of that difficulty. We want to fix those.
Yeah. I sometimes think of the small communities of hunter-gatherers, or people like, small groups of Inuit, maybe in, 10 or 20 living in a small community where somebody's always there. Somebody's always carrying the baby in the hood. And I do think city life makes things a little more difficult, shall we say? We don't always know the people next door, so we don't always pitch in when we know that the baby really needs a certain amount of cuddling and care.
Yeah, really well said. Well, I appreciate the context that you've both put this in, and with the biology of it as well. And I think of both of you as really excellent communicators and excellent scientific communicators in terms of taking this knowledge that we have and making sure that it's part of the public discourse. Would you say that in terms of, everything that you both have described and what we've learned about the importance of these bonds, are we really paying attention to that enough as a society? Or are there more things that we should do? Because Larry even talked about, if those things happen early on, we can change the trajectory. I'm wondering even what are some of the ways that we do change that trajectory? Yeah. I know I just asked two questions at once, but
I was thinking of the first one. Well, it depends on the society, because in many countries like Sweden, they have enacted laws and policies that really enhance the parental engagement, with paternal leave from work and longer time with the child. So In this country, we're lag behind some other countries,
Yeah.
but I think that we are, slowly gaining this understanding much more than we were 20, 40, 60 years ago. So we are making improvements. And, as science goes forward, this is the business we're in, science trying to figure out, how things work and how to make things better. I think that we are moving in the right direction just by appreciating the biology.
I think the other part of the story, too, that needs emphasis is that it isn't just that the child needs to be cuddled and so forth. It also, especially in humans, but also dogs and many kinds of species of mammal, the infants are hugely disposed to imitate others, adults, siblings, and so forth. And how they learn the norms of their group is from watching and interacting and doing things and being told, yes, that's great, or no, you don't want to do that, and so forth. And this is a part of the story that engages a very ancient system, and that is the reward system, which is largely subcortical, but of course has very dense interactions with cortex as well. And so it's really important not only that the children are loved and nurtured, but they also have the opportunities to interact in social ways so that they come to understand that on the whole, truth-telling is better than fibbing, and that disagreements can best be resolved sometimes by working it out rather than by bonking somebody on the noggin, and so on. But they need to pick these things up. And if they are raised in circumstances that are really grim, they're going to pick up very different kinds of norms. And then it's going to be hard to undo those. And so I think that's a reason why family life and extended family life are really very important, why grandparents have an important role to play, and as well as siblings and aunts and uncles and neighbors and dogs. So, it is. I mean, dogs teach kids a lot. And that's, they're learning norms that most of us can't even articulate even now. But we know. We know.
Yeah, that's so important. And again, it seems that there's just a lot of onus on each member of the family and the community in so many different ways. I mean, I'm wondering also just from a philosophical perspective, what does that say about us as humans and the importance of altruism? I mean, as we have learned about all these different outcomes and effects that these interactions can have on our fellow human beings, what responsibility would you say that has for us as fellow humans?
Well, I think, we, even in small hunter-gatherer groups, people understand in a very deep way the importance of cooperation and mutual defense and so forth. And I think that children are very quick to pick that up. We also see in cross-species alliances, for example, between wolves and humans, or between wolves and Galata baboons, that there can be very close relationships because they cooperate with each other. And that's really valuable. In the case of us and the baboons, the wolves are very important in helping to drive off predators. And in return, the baboons tolerate them. They don't snuggle with them in the way we snuggle with dogs, but maybe it took us a few generations as well. I don't know.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about altruism is that we've learned from, in work with animals, but also in humans, is that we tend to think of others in our species as either within our group or out-group. And so we exhibit altruistic behavior towards those that are in our group. And altruistic behavior is, someone needs help and you help them. You detect that they need the help and then you help them. And I think that evolved from the brain mechanisms of maternal behavior, because mothers are always altruistic.
Yeah.
They can hear their pup being in distress, or their baby, or they can, a wildebeest can see their baby being approached by a lion. And then they'll risk their life to help that their baby. But I think in humans, the same neurobiological processes have been expanded to others in our group. Because when we help our group does better. The problem is who do we see as in our group, and who do we see outside of our group? And I think that those divisions of who's us and who's not. I mean, you can see it in politics right now. Us and them. And so that kind of division was something that we really need to grapple with, how to erase those boundaries and sort of, so that the group becomes, all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And increasingly, I think, people are recognizing that because the planet isn't an infinitely large place, and because things like climate affect us all, that we do need to cooperate with people that we don't know and maybe never see, and so forth. Nevertheless, I think this is almost certainly to remain the case, but the strongest desire for help and reaching out and so forth is going to be local. There is a group of philosophers who say that's wrong, that it should always be, the person who's most needy wherever they are on the planet. But, I have this friend who cuts people's hair. She's a hairdresser, I guess. And a couple of times a month, she takes her tools and a chair and goes down and cuts the hair of homeless people. Now, maybe they don't need her time as much as somebody else on the other side of the planet. But I think it's asking too much to ask her, to figure out who really needs her help and to quit running downtown to help to cut the hair of the homeless people. On the other hand, where I absolutely agree with Larry is that we don't want to let localness kind of be the enemy of looking further afield when it's really important to do so. And so we have to both, be motivated, as we all are, when it's somebody we know. But we also don't want to have the sort of in-group thing where we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. That's when the trouble starts.
Yeah. Yeah. So many important pieces there. And I love how you've tied in that aspect of altruism and just what the science has showed us about the within group versus the without group. So many directions I could go, and I'm formulating the ideas as I talk through this. So bear with me as we go through it. But that's just something that we've thought a lot about on this podcast, as well as we've talked about aspects of social justice. And then even Larry, as you were talking, it reminded me of those components too, thinking who is within the group and who is outside, and the benefits of helping those within our group. But then also on the flip side, the detriments of things that happen within the group. So I've referenced a couple of times, some of David Williams' work at Harvard, looking specifically at Black and Brown communities and the long-term detrimental mental health effects when there are individuals in those communities who are killed at the hands of police when they're unarmed. So the way it goes both ways. And so even as we're talking about this, just makes me think, and not that there's evidence for this per se, but the power of expanding those groups and what that would do for us collectively as a society, whether there would be some of these aspects of the bonding that would happen from a biological perspective that would have long-term effects, even in adults, even though we're past.
Yeah. No, I agree. There is some work on chimpanzees who, where the field observers were watching two groups because they were both getting rather large, and they rather suspected that there was going to be a bit of a fight eventually, which there was, but they managed to collect urine samples from the members of the group before and after the incident. The oxytocin levels had gone through the roof. these guys were all of a sudden so bonded to each other. And also probably, I mean, Larry could speak to this better than I, their stress levels had gone down. And so they weren't quite as afraid. And boy, did they go at it. And that's very biological. Now, are humans like that? It would surprise me if we didn't see it, for example, in football teams. Or basketball teams. Maybe baseball's too slow for it, but
yeah, you certainly do. If you give someone oxytocin and you tell them that these people are on your team, you're more likely to do something altruistic to them, and maybe be more defensive to someone who's you are told is not on your team. And so, I think that
it's a big deal.
It's a very difficult thing in terms of racism in the society, and to fix it right away. It's not going to be an instant fix, of course. But if by thinking about this, the biology of responding to in groups and out groups, what we need to do is to try to, think of ways, move forward in ways so that race is not, or skin color is not a factor to determine in group versus out group.
Yeah.
And that, can be done, through, making sure that diversity is represented in all aspects of our lives. So we can see, whatever we are doing, there's a lot of different kinds of people that are also like that, and rather than, and it just takes time to reach everybody in that kind of way.
Yeah. Really?
I think that's probably true. I mean, I would love for these things to move faster, but I'm always gratified when, I see how, for example, sportscasters and newscasters in general, how it used to be, your basic white male. And now there's women, there's people of color, there's, all kinds. And because people watch television so much, I mean, maybe I'm just being foolishly optimistic, but I think those things matter. And I think it is making a difference, but we've got a long way to go.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the way that you both framed that as well. And then even as we've been talking, thinking back to some of the earlier comments that we had in the conversation too, it also makes me wonder, and this is getting a little speculative, but just about those bonds early in life too. Early in childhood, if there are windows of opportunity to expand that circle in a sense, like you were talking about, Larry, so that those bonds form earlier and that there's less of this we and them, us and them kind of framework from early on. And whether, from a biological perspective, whether that would also have long-term effects as people become adults. And again, I'm speculating, but just as we're having this conversation and thinking through some of those topics as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there was some work done in rats, though, where you have rats that have the different patterns of fur, and if they're raised with other rats that have a different color pattern of fur, then they were more likely to show helpful behavior to them. So it does. Early learning is important.
I think so.
And so, I think this is just something that we as a society have to recognize is important and just pay attention to that and increase, exposure to all kinds of people. And so that, the skin color and all of these things are not nationality or ethnic background, are not the divisors of groups.
I remember when I was in first grade in school. Again, this is this tiny little school in British Columbia. And there was an influx of kids who wore leather pants that were cut off above the knees. And of course, what had happened was that there were a number of Germans who were moved to this area to farm and start a new life after the war. And we were all absolutely fascinated by this. And of course, by the fact that they didn't talk like us. But, when you're only 6, these things don't matter very much. So within, I don't know, 6 months or whatever, it was all kind of they were still wearing their leather pants because I think they couldn't afford other pants, but but it didn't matter anymore. And kids are much more easy about these things than adults, where we're kind of ossified a little bit, I suppose you'd say.
Yeah. And I'm sure that ties back to the biology as well.
I think
the learning. So lots that we could learn from the younger ones among us as well.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up, I was also just going to ask a little bit about, some of the biology that we've been touching on, but of consolation behavior. And then, in this mode that we're in of kind of the ups and downs of the pandemic, what that has also meant for us, as there haven't been as the same types of ways to express that consolatory behavior. And if there are ways that can also inform how we interact moving forward. Because Larry, as you mentioned, this is not something that's going to be gone anytime soon. So Larry, I guess we could start with you as you've studied some of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so you mentioned consolation, that this is something that we've studied in the voles, where we see that if an animal's partner is distressed or someone they know is distressed, they release the oxytocin, and it makes them be tuned into that partner and recognize that they're distressed and then do something. And, I think that we're organized in such a way that, we detect others when they're in distress and have some urge to help them. And maybe we don't do that as much, when we're isolated and things like that. But I think just being aware, that this is something that we should do, that doing that, it's the right thing to do. To help someone recognize when someone is in distress. It's also hard for us to know when people are in distress. We see them once in a while on Zoom. We don't know what's going on when they're, alone. And just to kind of be aware of, ask people, how are you doing? And reach out to them to help if they need help.
Anything you want to add to that as well?
Well, I was just thinking of other species. There's this wonderful data that Frans de Waal has of chimpanzees consoling other chimpanzees, and in the wild as well as in captivity. But of course, dogs are incredible in that way too. If you're upset or you're tearful or you've fallen, or the dog will come and they'll nuzzle and they'll lick. And if it's a baby, I mean, this used to be just waved off as anecdotes. But now there's so much real data as well as lots and lots of anecdotes on YouTube. It's hard to dismiss.
I think one thing that's happened during this pandemic is that people have realized how much of a lifeline that their pets are.
Yes, absolutely.
Because they really have bonded even more strongly with their pets, and their pets are a source of joy. And that's really social interaction. That's see them as others. And so, that's something we sort of, in the absence of other interactions, we sort of built and strengthened that. And that can help improve, mental health. But I do think that people need to eventually wean themselves off of only that. Because having real human social interactions is so important for so many other things.
One thing I've often wondered, and I doubt there's any way that anyone's looked at this yet, is just some of the things that you've talked about in terms of the oxytocin being released in certain interactions and how it can also build trust. Whether that can also happen on Zoom, if it happens at a lesser.
That's a big deal.
I don't know if people have been talking about that specifically, or.
That is a big deal.
People have been talking about that since before Zoom, before the pandemic, as people started texting. So children who hear are with their mother and hear their mother's voice, or their father, engaging with them, they have this big peak of oxytocin. But if you get a text, you don't. And I'm sure that the oxytocin release that you get, I mean, even if you're just interacting with another person and it's a positive interaction, the eye-to-eye contact is causing oxytocin release. And that's like, it's kind of like exercising your social brain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You need that from a day-to-day basis. And when you only get the interactions through Zoom, I don't think you're having that same kind of interactions. You don't feel the connections. You're a 2D, you're a 2D image that moves. And so that's having long-term impacts, I think.
There's an additional thing here, which is that oxytocin has what is sometimes referred to as a sibling peptide, which is vasopressin. And sometimes the release of vasopressin can have to do with, being careful, anxiety, caution, and so forth. And it turns out that this is work by Sue Carter, that oxytocin can bind to vasopressin receptors with the upshot that there can be, yes, but maybe not. And when I first read her paper, I thought about some of the male-female encounters one has, especially, for example, as a teenager. Is he really being mean, or is that a joke? Or I kind of like him, but maybe not. But I think those sorts of complex dynamics, those ambiguities, are often in play, even when we are contemplating helping someone or wondering whether we should, give them shelter and so forth. Is it? You
have to be vigilant on who you help.
You have to be.
And there's interesting work on rats, showing that an adult rat, if they're have a choice to interact with a juvenile rat that's in distress versus another adult male that's in distress, they avoid that adult male that's in distress, if they help the juvenile.
Interesting.
Because an adult who is in distress could be dangerous. So, and that is also regulated by oxytocin and vasopressin these brain mechanisms. So many of the things that we that we engage in every day that we don't even think about what's going on in the brain.
Right.
Yeah.
We're starting to understand the hormones, the chemicals in the brain that's doing it, but also now the circuitry. We're learning more and more about the circuitry of how it's working, and how the consequences of that are accumulating over years to change our behavior. And I think that the real, what I'm really excited about of the future of this area of research, is that there are a lot of psychiatric situations, psychiatric disorders, the depression where people are withdrawn socially. There's also autism or schizophrenia and other areas, psychiatric disorders where people are just, resistant to interacting with socially or incapable. That what we've been learning through these animals and with this oxytocin system is how we might be able to tweak the brain circuitry and tweak these neurochemicals so that we can help improve the social outcome of these disorders. And that's really the reason why I'm doing the work that I'm doing is to try to, to help us have a better, navigate the social world in a better way.
Awesome.
And it's so exciting and so encouraging in a lot of ways, especially as you mentioned, because it touches on so many different mental health challenges and psychiatric illnesses. And really is key to how we interact on a day-to-day basis.
Oh, yeah. And so complicated.
I think in a lot of ways, the listeners will really enjoy listening to this episode too, and just maybe even self-evaluating as you all have shared so many anecdotes and just thinking about, our daily interactions. Because even as we were talking about the difference between Zoom and in person. I'm thinking, during certain times during the pandemic, just going to the grocery store and making eye contact with a complete stranger, and how elevating and encouraging that felt and could kind of lift me through the rest of the day, as opposed to talking with people I knew really well just by Zoom. So there's a lot there, and a lot that we're still learning moving forward. As a closing question, what are the things that give you all hope as we move forward in our world with all that about social bonding, and then also as we think about how we continue to navigate the pandemic? Pat, I guess we can start with you with this one.
Well, I think in lots of ways people have really pulled together and been very sensible and tried to do the best they can. I think there have been many regrettable things, as we all know. but there are these kind of intervals where humans fill us with despair. And then, time moves on and the despair changes to optimism and hope and so forth. And I mean, maybe this is just an old lady speaking, but I remain very hopeful about the future and about how people will work together to solve certain kinds of problems, even though maybe at the moment we wish that there was more cooperation and less sort of name calling.
Yeah, I think in the last couple of years, our world has really been shaken up. Mine was shaken up, with the politics and with COVID and just, thinking about what the future holds. And so, I think there was a depth, we were in a deep spot. And that's why I changed my life, was trying to be healthy. I lost like 40 pounds and everything.
I thought you did. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think that we're going to do the same thing as a society.
I
we're
think
look
so.
back, it's not just COVID. It's politics.
Yeah.
Social injustice issues and all these things. There's really turmoil. Okay. But, we're going to get through this. And pretty soon it's going to be 2 years later, 4 years later, 5, 10 years later. We're going to look back at that and we're going to say that was a changing point.
Mm-hmm.
And also, in terms of the science, we're going to think about the things that we know. And there have been a lot of changes in terms of, social justice and attention to diversity and things that have been happening. I think that's going to continue. And I'm an optimist. So I like to see things that have happened that were really bad in a positive light because they're creating positive change.
And I think they do actually. And sometimes you just have to go through this sort of dark night of the soul to come out at the other end and really good things will happen. So like
World War II and the baby boomers,
who knew?
Yeah. Opportunity in a lot of ways.
I think.
Yeah. Well, definitely appreciate both of you being here. Again, I think this is going to be so enlightening for a lot of folks and encouraging
I hope so.
Be able to listen to the insights that you shared and, just a fascinating research and all the different angles and nuances. And I think just also, just to have a better understanding of how some of the animal models and what we can learn from the animal kingdom about how we interact as humans as well. And then just thinking developmentally. So grateful to both of you for taking time out of your schedules, your busy schedules. I'm impressed by both of your exercise routines, by the way. So that's something that is going to have to encourage me to turn into action, hopefully.
Yes.
Yeah. Actually, exercise raises the level of oxytocin. There you go. It'll feel good.
Yeah. So that gives me more
not
motivation.
At first, but
yes, well said.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks so much to both of you for being on the Addy Hour. Definitely appreciate your time and all the insights that you shared.